Hello and welcome to episode 55 of the TRUUMAN Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by Aaron Clark. Aaron, it's an absolute pleasure. How are you doing today?
Very good, thank you, mate. Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's okay. I'm really looking forward to this one today. It should be a good one for sure. But before we get into it, Aaron, in your own words, what makes you a man?
What makes me a man? Understanding the true elements and kind of parts of being a man well, I think is what makes me a man. I think as men, we typically forget that it's okay to show vulnerability, that it's okay to have a weakness, to show that not everything is easy and that we don't always have to be tough. And I think through my work, through my professional regimes, through my different hats, through personal journey, personal life, I've come to realize that actually having those elements is really, really important. And actually how we define, a typical alpha male, which I've always seen myself as, a true alpha is able to then look at those things that don't go well, recognize our vulnerabilities, recognize our weaknesses, as well as having those strengths and those powers and those skills and those abilities, actually recognizing also that there's a fine balance as a true man, as a true alpha. And being able to have all of those different elements makes that alpha figure in you the strongest it can be.
Okay, I love that. That's a true alpha. That's a nice summary of what you've just said. So, Aaron, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you actually do in the space?
Yeah, no problem at all. So many hats, Lewis. I've always worn a number of different hats, and my hats have always kind of placed themselves in mental health, young people, difficult, hard to reach communities, fitness, exercise, recreation, and bringing together of communities. So in whatever way, shape or form that exists itself in, bringing people together because of shared value, because of shared interest, because of shared experiences, shared journeys, and making sure that people never feel like they're alone in what they're doing. I think that's really important. I feel all too often, people feel quite alone in what they're doing. They feel like they're the only ones going through it or the only ones involved in that experience. And actually, that's not true. We're all going through our own kind of processes. We're all in that same rough water. Just depends on how our boats are coping with that difficult sea at that time. So, big aim for me in everything that I've done is kind of that working with people, those really hard to reach individuals on a number of different levels. Leadership, inspirational talking, motivation, community development, young people, mentoring, military community. So a number of different kind of areas of expertise and different hats and skill sets. I was also very proud to have founded the first mental health fitness movement in the UK, Mental Health Muscle. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit today. Bringing people together in a fitness, bodybuilding, sport type community to recognize that actually fitness has a crucial part to play in improving our mental well-being and helping us and supporting our mental health. And actually for a lot of people has been a savior and a real escapism for people to kind of work on their mental well-being and get better and do better in life. So yeah, lots of different things like that. I'm a big musician, love music. I'm a pianist, a singer, always been involved with that sort of thing too. And then a number of different things that I love doing, which I'm sure we'll dive into. But we could be here forever, Lewis, if I was to tell you everything about me in a short synopsis.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is the problem with this. We could genuinely be speaking for days, which, I mean, is fun. But yeah, we'll try and keep it succinct for now. But
100%.
What I absolutely love about this space is that usually there's a reason to why people get into it. So why don't you sort of let's rewind a little bit. Let's get back to the nitty gritty and let's sort of talk about how you found yourself in this space.
Yeah, no problem at all. So I was a military child. So spent the first 18 years of my life, right up until I kind of left home permanently for university, etc. in that military sphere. My dad was an armed forces serving member. My granddad was an armed forces serving member. Lived on military bases for most of my childhood, moving around a lot, being detached and deployed elsewhere all over the shop. So Germany, Wales, Scotland, England a number of times. Dad being kind of serving in Afghan, Kuwait, Kosovo, Falklands, etc. So, plenty of movement around that kind of childhood space. And I guess for me, although I didn't think about it at the time, I was often left to kind of be the man of the house. Dad being away a lot in that forces environment and kind of having those expectations of needing to look after your little brother, your mum. Dad's not around at the moment, so you have to kind of stand up and shout up and be heard and make sure everybody's okay and keep your dad's kind of, leadership and discipline and all that kind of going whilst Dad's not around. There was no point that Dad ever said to me, son, you're in charge. But certainly that expectation was on my shoulders. And I think I carried quite a lot of imposter syndrome as a young person, making sure that I was doing the best, being the best, and never showing that vulnerability or that weakness as often as possible, just to keep people going in those hard times when, kind of your parents aren't always around and they're away on deployment or off to conflict, etc. And that happened quite a lot. And when I was kind of 11, 12, I said to mum and dad, I can't do this anymore. I need to go and find somewhere I can be more stable. So off I went to boarding school for 6 years, and really developed kind of that independence, understanding of living on your own and not seeing your parents a lot. It was difficult, don't get me wrong, but certainly a really great experience. I was surrounded by other military children, which really helped as well, whose parents were also away all the time and living abroad, etc., in that military sphere. And when I was at boarding school, a very good friend of mine, my roommate actually at the time, took his own life. He was 15. It was kind of something that happened almost like that. And then the next day, nobody spoke about it. Nobody asked any questions. Nobody asked how anybody was. And you move on and the conversation disappears and a life is lost and nobody knows why or nobody answers any questions and that's it. And although at the time I kind of was a part of that, let's not talk about it, let's just move on and develop, years ahead, I kind of look back and I think, why was that? And I think that was quite a catalyst to me wanting to be able to try and change how suicide is seen, how mental health is seen. And it wasn't until I really got myself involved in that kind of professional remit of work, supporting young people, understanding mental health better and recognizing mental health and some of my own demons as well, and understanding how I was built up and my character and why I did certain things and why I felt certain ways. So a real catalyst. And like I say, at the time, not really thought about, but much later on in my career, realized that actually that was a little bit of a kind of turning point, although at the time I didn't realize that. And then since then, kind of just dived into as many things that I can do to support other people. I'm a hugely passionate professional in terms of making sure that other people get better and improve, and there's always hope and it can be found. And so kind of plunge myself into any environment that allows me to help other people and do good.
What do you think the reasoning was around the lack of conversation around your friend?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a number of things, really. One of them is that I guess it was just that era. So this was early 2000s, early millennium, when not anybody really knew what suicide was. I don't think suicide was a word that you saw in advertisements or in social media. Social media wasn't really as big then as it is now. It was a very taboo subject and frowned upon. Also within the military community, it wasn't really talked about. Nobody really understood it. Nobody talked about that. I think being at a boarding school and a public school, there was a real tendency to avoid that type of conversation because, one, it maybe didn't look good to the outside world if you were considering taking your child to that boarding school and the news was person takes their own life at the school that you were about to send your child to. There's kind of all of that going on. Politics, money, all of those things, I think, contributed to why it wasn't spoken about. I think deep down, a number of us knew, but the conversation just wasn't there. It wasn't just me affected. It was most of us because we all knew that person. We all knew that lad. We were all quite close to him. The boarding school at the time wasn't that big. And so everybody knew everybody's business and everybody's brother and sister and family and where they lived. And, there wasn't many of us. We were a very tight-knit family, if you like, rather than just a group of friends. So I think that was kind of the number of contributors, Lewis, I think. And I guess just like I say, the big one for me was that suicide just wasn't something people talked about. And I think at an early age of, 14, 15, you may have been told something, but is that the truth? Is that actually what's happened? So you don't know, you don't have the education, so you just don't push that conversation. And I think for a lot of people, including myself, that was quite difficult at the time.
Do you think your character sort of boded well for boarding school? You're obviously quite charismatic, well out there, versatile. Obviously, boarding school has differing stories from whoever you hear it from, and it's like how dare you send your kid away and not do this, and then you hear from other people how I met this brotherhood, everyone was my friend, like these are friends for life. Like, what's your view on it all?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that I've had a few times in terms of like, what was boarding school like? For me, it was the best time of my life, and I don't think I could describe it any other way. Despite some of the challenges and some of the sadness that I had at boarding school, one, leaving home for the first time and being, 11 years old, 12 years old, and moving away from home for full-time education and living away from home, that was always a big thing. But I kind of embraced that, and a lot of me wanted that. So it wasn't like mum and dad had just sent me off without my kind of acknowledgement or consent. I asked to go to boarding school. It was my request. So I said to mum and dad, I can't do this anymore. I can't move around all these schools. I wasn't settling very well in Scotland in the Scottish education system. And I said, please, can I go to boarding school? My mum was devastated, heartbroken. And my dad was kind of just more, if that's what you want, boy, if that's what you want, son, I'll miss you, of course. But, it was one of those. Dad was really supportive about it. Mum was really supportive about it. And off I went. We had a few trial days and a few taster sessions. And within the space of 6 months, I started at a school just outside of York. And I loved my time there. I was there for just short of 6 years. And I can't say a bad word about it. It made me who I am today. I arrived a young boy and I left a young man, and I was so ready for that, and I embraced it and I loved it. I luckily had my grandparents just up the road. So I did a number of weekends where I went home and kind of connected with family. But often, I wouldn't see my parents and my little brother for 3-4 months at a time, school term. So yeah, it was good. I have no issues about it. Very much enjoyed it. And I look back very fondly. And funnily enough, went back to the same boarding school to do a year's worth of house parenting after I finished university. So I've always kept in touch with it. Huge part of their alumni association. And a lovely era in my life. And actually, my wife now is someone I went to school with at that boarding school. And we reconnected and refound each other, and married with 3 kids now 10 years later. So it holds a very special place in my heart, mate. So difficult to say anything other than positive stuff about it, really.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it all worked out quite well for you. I agree. Like I obviously didn't go to boarding school. I went to a comprehensive, but going to uni definitely shaped me from what I was at 17, 18 to what I am now. Obviously, there's a degree element to it, but like the pure social and forcing you to sort of step out of your comfort zone and sort of leave and find your own way. It's it's definitely a good way to shape you, which is why I'm a little bit against sort of the negativity towards university and sort of like, oh, it's a pointless degree and stuff like this. I think you can get a lot more out of it than just
100%.
a degree. So yeah, it's but you obviously got to do that at a younger age, which I guess is nice. It's helpful. It's it really rounds you, I guess. When did you start to make the step into this space? What was your sort of catalyst into it? What was your first hat?
First hat. So my first hat was I supported a number of boys at an all-boys school, all with severe autism, Asperger's, Tourette's, a number of learning difficulties. And I was a kind of special needs coordinator / carer, if you like, who looked after a number of these young lads with severe complex difficulties and issues and challenges. And obviously, the key aim of working with those wasn't at the time work with them on their mental health, but very quickly you realize that actually the impact that a number of these challenges or these disorders have on someone mean that someone struggles with their mental well-being. And so, there's a lot of low mood, there's a lot of depressional states, there's a lot of anxiety incurred, there's a lot of behavioral difficulties, etc. So kind of at that point, started to hone in on, actually, that's something that I'd really love love to do on a full-time basis. So I moved from there to the Prince's Trust. And I think the Prince's Trust for me, my kind of 4 years in the Prince's Trust, I was an area manager, team leader for the West Yorkshire. So I covered Pontefract, Castleford, Wakefield, Halifax, Bradford, Leeds, etc. Working with young people 16 to 25 on a 12-week program, bringing them out of their situations, whether that was domestic violence, drugs and alcohol, homelessness, young offenders, NEETs, and putting them into full-time education, training, or employment by the end of the 12 weeks. And all of them, regardless of where I got them from or where their cohorts were originally, had mental health issues in some way, shape, or form. Some of them far less than others. Some of them quite severe, suicidal ideation and kind of reclusiveness, hoarding, obsessive compulsive disorder. The list goes on. And that was when I really kind of dived into. I love supporting people with these mental health challenges. But also at the same time, Lou, I was kind of developing these identifying themes in myself. And when I was supporting these young people, was like, I felt like that for a long time, or I feel like that sometimes. That's similar to my behavior. I'm quite Jekyll and Hyde. I can go from being lovely, fluffy daddy to, a really quite angry, temperamental guy very, very quickly. And so I was kind of developing all these things and thinking, actually, you know what, there's a number of things here that I can relate to. So continue to kind of develop, learn, understand myself, but support these young people. There about 200 of them by the time of the 4 years had passed. Amazing time. And then from there, I moved down to Devon and completely uplifted our life in the north. I moved down to Devon, where I dived into 9 years of community development. So managing vulnerable communities in Devon. And that's where that kind of mental health leadership, lead role, strategic working in mental well-being really picked up. I was in charge and then lead on most of the mental health provisions in the district. I wrote the first mental health strategy for housing and really kind of dived into mental health well and truly through that. And then I left there and I did just under 2 years at a mental health charity in Devon as the strategic lead. So I ran all the services and operations that we were doing with young people in Devon. And at the same time, created and set up Mental Health Muscle, which was a not-for-profit organisation which used education, sport, exercise, bodybuilding particularly, as a way for people to work on their mental health. And we went from no followers, no kind of audience to nearly 80,000 people in the space of 18 months. Just blew up, absolutely blew up. Can't tell you how quickly it blew up. So that was kind of, that was it. And then in 2022, I went through a really difficult spout of depression and really hit rock bottom, and something had to give. And that was Mental Health Muscle, unfortunately. I was the kind of volunteer, founder, director, admin, finance man, treasurer, everything, everything that organization did was down to me, and my bucket just overflowed. I was creating a young family at the time with my wife, and something had to go and I needed to reprioritize. And unfortunately, one thing had to go, and that was Mental Health Muscle. So, So now, since then, I've just kind of continued with a lot of the mental health kind of awareness workshops, education, training, inspirational guest workshops, keynote talks. I do a lot of online coaching with some clients around well-being and their fitness goals, etc. Yeah, lots of different things, but always found myself in that space.
Yeah, amazing. Like you say, many hats, and then a few more when you started doing something of your own as well, which I can attest to. You soon get there for sure. Obviously, a lot of your work's with children, and more recently, I've been doing a lot of research into boys and sort of the negative impacts and the positive impacts, I guess, about talking about vulnerability and mental health and that side of things. Can you go into a little bit more detail in regards to the youth and how they sort of see mental health and on that side?
Yeah, of course. So my work at the moment, far less involved with young people, more military now, but certainly from my kind of 10 years in that space, young people are dealing with a very different society as the older generation dealt with. We have now the ever-present social media, which causes a lot of problems and can really influence positively, but negatively too, a young person's mental well-being. A regular day-to-day comparison, scrolling through needless nonsense and taking those things and that content for gospel and trying to, navigate away from that. And you never really know what to believe. Everybody's got a different opinion. It's a really confusing place for young people. There's also a far bigger awareness and presence of mental health and the discussion around mental health now. And I feel like young people of today are very much in that midst. Education around mental well-being is very much out there. It wasn't 20, 30 years ago, so young people didn't tend to talk about it. Nowadays, young people all talk about it because they're being confronted with it on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis at school, in their jobs, wherever they are, which is great, don't get me wrong. But with more awareness and more education comes more people attaching themselves to certain diagnosis, symptoms, issues, concerns, behaviors. So when you increase the awareness of something, it's great, but it also means that everybody else starts going onto Google and diagnosing themselves through Dr. Google about these things that they might have or the symptoms that they're experiencing and why they're kind of in the situation they're in. And that's really challenging. That's really difficult because you go from having nothing on something to everything on something very, very quickly. Yeah. You're surrounded by your peers who are also doing the same thing. Unfortunately, we're then confronted with a number of trends online. So the ice bucket challenge was where it started quite calmly. Then it moved to the ice cube with the salt. Then it moved to self-harm parties. Then it moved to groups talking about what's the best way to kill yourself. Really extreme things that young people are confronted with. Eating disorders, food, relationship with food is a huge one for young people. That kind of constant peer pressure about girls being the skinniest and smallest they can be and lads being the most muscular and strongest they can be, and this really poisonous dynamic and spectrum that young people find themselves on in trying to stand out from the crowd. So yeah, young people have got a lot going on, Lou. There's a lot for them to deal with. Young people also who come from communities that are traditionally more stigmatized, carry a much heavier cultural, traditional, archaic, we do not talk about mental health, grow a stiff lip, grow some balls, lad, get a grip, you'll be fine. We have a lot of that. And so young people are from that kind of dynamic, and that proves a lot of challenges too. So yeah, a host of different things. I'm glad I was a young person when I was a young person. I can say that for sure. Gender equality, identity, belonging, who you are. There's so much going on in that young person space for them to deal with.
A few things to touch on there. I think one thing that I sort of iterate a lot on this podcast is it used to be Keeping Up with the Joneses. It is literally Keeping Up with the Kardashians now. Like, it is a TV show, but it is that is the social lens that you judge your life on, and you try and keep up on, for sure. So I completely agree on that side of things. One thing that I would love to just sort of talk on a little bit more is the weaponization of these words and that side of things. So obviously, young father yourself, how are you looking to sort of navigate that in the future? Because obviously we want these open conversations, but there's also a case of, like you say, Dr. Google.
Yeah. I guess it's a really difficult one. And I think there's still not a clear way of how we approach that, because with the different communities that you're getting involved with, you have communities that absolutely don't want to talk about this, and they carry huge stigma. So everything you say is a no-go, taboo. Then you have a community that really want to talk about it, but are influenced by the other community in terms of how they feel about themselves, whether they're allowed to talk about how they feel about themselves, whether they have permission from society to talk about how they're feeling mentally. So there's this real kind of set of scales for me about how do we approach that best. I think the best thing is to make sure that we reduce the stigma and we normalize the conversations around mental well-being. We can only do that by changing the way that we talk about mental health, the language. So very simple things for young people particularly. So sadly, someone committed suicide. In my opinion, my professional opinion, and I hope that stands for enough, nobody commits suicide. Suicide is not a crime. To commit something means someone has done wrong. Yeah. And so that language in society absolutely needs to change. Someone takes their own life, or someone thinks about taking their own life. Nobody commits suicide. Unfortunately, again, social media especially from the American side of the world, commit suicide is exactly what they would say. And so you are influenced by this constant negotiation around the types of language that you use. You might have heard in your life, Lewis, someone say, "Oh, I'm a little bit OCD." And actually, we've used that phrase for so long that actually we forget how offensive or how difficult that would be for someone with a diagnosis of OCD to hear. Because actually, someone who just likes their pens in color order doesn't mean they've got OCD. But if they were stood or sat next to someone that did have OCD and was dealing with those high intrusive thoughts and low intrusive thoughts on a day-to-day, hourly basis, the person who said that would have absolutely no idea how it actually felt to have OCD, right? So it's that language. So by changing that language, kind of influencing that language positively to get people talking about it in a much safer way, I think is really important. So there's a number of things that we can do, but for me, that language is really important, and it's the kind of rollout of that mental health provision, really difficult.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I like, for me, I'm sort of torn when it comes to suicide and that terminology around it, because what I'm cautious of is making it accessible, right? I want to reduce suicide. I do want it to be seen as, it's not crime, and like there's a lot of studies into why people commit suicide, but it's final. It is the end, and it is as someone who's had suicidal thoughts, to even consider it now is scary. It's not something that I want people to do or consider. So I'm cautious around that, and I think that's tough. Like there's going to be some conversation somewhere that someone's got to have that I don't want to be a part of, because they're hard to have for sure. But it's terminology is something. One thing that you did mention in the first bit, which was that you wouldn't want to be a child now. But going back to your experience and what happened to you, are you sure about that?
It's a really good question. Yeah, really good question. No one's asked me that before, Lewis. It's a really good question. And I think I still stand by what I said, because actually I think there's an element of, although I understand the modern day world for young people and can see the challenges that they went through, and that we're able to talk about them far more and they're far more present, I think what I didn't know didn't kill me. Sorry to use the pun, when I was a young person. So, looking back now as an adult in this professional arena, there's parts of me that are grateful that actually there wasn't as much discussion around it, because I would have had a very different pathway, I think. I kind of allowed my difficulties, the experiences that I went through, to kind of build me up and add to my armor a little bit. So I built resilience, I think, far quicker than young people do these days, because you just got on with it. Now, I'm not saying that's right, and I advocate that isn't right, but that is what it was. We can't change history, right? That is how it was. Yeah. So for me, I was able to go, okay, I act this way, I feel this way. This is my approach and my behavior around certain things, particularly change and not having control of things, which still burdens me in my adult life today as a 35-year-old father. Still a challenge. But I built up the resilience back then to be able to manage and work with that better, so that in my adult life, I can now look back and say, I actually dealt with that really well. I didn't know what was going on, but I did deal with that quite well. Not always, but more often than not, I dealt with it quite well. Now I have the knowledge to be able to understand what happened and why that happened. I think we're working and I go back to your question again, I think we're working in a very different world, aren't we? Today's world looks very different to the world that I grew up in as a young person. And although that was only 20 years ago, the two look very different. Would I have liked someone to grab my hand or put their arm on my shoulder and help me in those times that I was struggling as a young person? Yes, I would have loved that. So that didn't really exist. I got it from my parents, amazing. Got it from my grandparents, amazing. But were there any professionals around me that kind of maybe par one or two that did that? No. Did you as friends go, are you all right, mate? Are you feeling okay? Like, how's your head? Nobody did that really. It was just like, oh, that's just how Aaron is. That's what he does. That's Aaron. That's why we love him. Whereas nowadays, you're checking in on your mates, you're checking in on your friends, you're checking on your family members if you notice there's a change in behaviour or they're looking a little bit low or down in the dumps, and you have that conversation. So, both eras offer positives, both eras offer negatives. I'm a great believer in the now, the present day. I can only change and manipulate and influence what is happening now. So what's happened. And I know now that the challenges for young people are severe, and I didn't experience those same challenges as a young person. So that's kind of where I'm coming with that, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. I think resilience is understated and under talked about these days. I think there is a lot of conversations of sort of sitting in it, which as someone who sat in it, I don't think is useful. It's not somewhere that you particularly want to be. I've now sort of pivoted this podcast in a sense that the people that I bring on have a story, but they also have a little bit of a solution or something they've tried and something that they think that has worked. And you've obviously touched on exercise and bodybuilding and that side of things. But let's talk about, rather than the complexities of words and how we use them, let's talk about something that's actionable and something that we can do. So how do you think that you can start to build resilience?
Yeah, it's a good question. So resilience, importantly, is something that we do not build overnight. You don't go to bed with no resilience one day and wake up the next morning with resilience. For some reason, I think there's this notion that that's what we do, and that people don't need time to build up resilience. And for me, as hard as it might be and as challenging as it might be, we only build true resilience in the most challenging and difficult areas or elements or experiences of our life. So if you experience no challenge or no adversity and life for you is pretty smooth sailing, it's likely that your resilience could be quite low because you've not had the experiences or the kind of presentation of, what do I do here to get out of this shit? How do I move forward from this dark spot? Because at the moment, if I don't change or it doesn't change, I'm not moving anywhere, and I'm going to stay sat in this really dark hole for as long as I can remember, right? As long as forward as I can think. So what have I got to do to get out of here? And that's where we really build that resilience, and we understand and we learn and we develop these kind of like self-help management techniques and toolkits to get out of that spot, so that if it happens again moving forward, and it does for many of us, these things tend to repeat themselves. It might not look the same, but they're familiar, they're similar. Then I've got better understanding of what I need to do if I should fall back into that dark hole again. So if we don't have those dark holes and life is just a constant increased trajectory of happiness and delight, it's really difficult to understand where that resilience comes from. Now, we can build resilience from good things and positive things in our life as well, but only then can they be useful if, again, that positive thing happens again, not if a negative thing happens. And I think life throws negative stuff at you. Life is difficult. Life is not easy. And I think there's more people than not that absolutely have those dark, difficult, challenging times, a number of them perhaps in their life. And that resilience is really born there. I'm a great believer in that. And I think resilience is really important. And it's not for everybody. Like I say, it doesn't just happen overnight. Some people don't know they've got resilience, or they don't understand that resilience has been built until you're then confronted with a situation where, what do I do here? I experienced something like this before. This is what I did. This is how it went. This is what I did, and it didn't work, so I'm not doing that again. This is how I felt. This is what I did to improve my mental well-being, so that's what I'm going to do again. It's having that self-empathy, and I love that terminology, like understanding yourself in a previous situation to be able to get out the situation that you currently find yourself in. So for me, that's where resilience is really important, and where it is built the most. And I'm not saying that you can't build resilience in certain areas if you don't have really difficult, challenging times. But I think those of us that really do have those dark, challenging times, we really are able to build that resilience and identify how to get out of that situation. So if it should happen again, you can use those skills and tools again.
For sure. I think that's where the best resilience is built, without a shadow of a doubt. You go through it and you problem solve it and you work through it, which is why I think it's such a powerful tool for men. I think it's something that men logically want to do. They want to solve problems. They want to do X, Y, and Z. But again, you sort of touched on it. Defining what is a dark time for you is impossible. It is just for you. It's all personal. It's what you can manage. It's what your stress levels can do. And hopefully,
Yep.
if you start to build resilience, that's meant to increase, and you're meant to be able to sort of take on bigger and bigger challenges. One thing that you're obviously massively big into, which is sport and exercise. I think that you can create tough times through challenges. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. And in what sense?
Well, like from a something as cliche as I'm going to run the London Marathon next year to I'm going to climb all 8 high peaks in the world. Like these are all physical challenges, right?
Love that. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Let's take bodybuilding, for example, Lou. Like bodybuilding is a difficult sport. For those that aren't really involved in bodybuilding or that kind of weightlifting environment, it can often seem a little bit misunderstood or a little bit like wish-washy. Like, what does that mean? Bodybuilding life is easy. It's really not easy. Like you are taking your body to the limits, the absolute limits of capacity, of energy, of everything. And so living the life of a bodybuilder can be very difficult. So you build resilience living the life that you have chosen to live, right? So you're restricting your food, you're training intensely on a regular, long-term periodization type format. There's little rest, or when there is rest, you're eating a lot more food. Like it's a really complex world. You're putting yourself in a position to be named and shamed and judged on a stage by people you've never met before, telling you whether you're good enough or bad enough. Like that's a real mental challenge, isn't it? Like, I'm allowing these people, this audience, to tell me whether I look good based on the last 24 weeks of really hard graft in the gym, eating nothing but chicken, broccoli, and rice that is really challenging. So we build huge resilience in that. And I think the more you do that, the more resilience you have. And that's not necessarily say that those things are dark times, but I could tell you, and one of the main reasons that I set Mental Health Muscle Up in the first instance was because I recognized not just people going to fitness as a way of working on their mental health, but actually some mental health implications that can come out of doing those really extreme kind of gym, sport life experiences. So being a professional sportsman, how many people do we hear and see in the news talking about their mental health struggles as a professional sportsman in a number of different fields? How many bodybuilders, particularly British bodybuilders and American, have we lost to suicide over the last 10 years? Like, it's a big deal. And so there's trying to find this fine balance, I think, a lot of the time. But yeah, I totally agree with you what you're saying. It's a complex environment to be involved with.
Yeah. But there's the whole body image side of that, right? Which obviously plays into the I imagine those statistics as well. Like,
yep.
It must be, you've got to, that's an interesting subsection of it to really think about. I'm not too up on it to sort of delve in it, but yeah, it's an interesting balance between pushing yourself to build resilience and also the disappointment if you don't actually achieve the goal that you set out, which I guess is just framing things a bit better, and maybe you weren't resilient enough to take on that challenge, which does make sense because you should pick challenges that you can sort of achieve. Like I went for a run this morning. It was very cold. It was 1 degree. I did not want to get out of bed. It was 7 a.m. It was still a bit dark. But I know I can run for 8K. Like I've done that many times. The weather was the challenge that day. It wasn't the case of the distance and stuff like that. So the only challenge was it was a bit cold. So there's no chance of me pushing myself over the edge doing that challenge, I guess. So yeah, it's a fine balance for sure. So what's is muscle memory going to be coming back? What's the plan with that?
Yeah. So no. Mental Health Muscle will remain as a legacy now, rather than an active impacting organization. We were incredibly successful for just short of 6 years, but it kind of ran its course purely because I needed to look after myself and I wasn't. And so, there comes a point where you have to realize that actually you're here supporting hundreds and hundreds of people, but you're neglecting yourself. So how do you continue to support everybody when you're not looking after yourself too, right? So I needed support. I needed to come away from all of that and get therapy. I went into therapy. I went into support. I tapped into a lot of resources and awareness sessions and training that allowed me to work on myself and kind of reprioritize, restructure my life, and recognize that looking after me was far more important than looking after everybody else. And although that to me has been a huge driver in my life in making sure that everybody else is okay before myself, there comes a point where I have no space left to support anybody else because my bucket is overflowing as some sort of like tsunami. And so there's no space, there's no provision, there's no capacity to support anybody else. And if I am supporting someone else, it's probably not the right thing to do, or it's probably not having any impact because I'm not in a place to be able to do that myself. So mental health muscle, amazing times. We did some incredible work. We raised money to support loads of people across the UK with their gym memberships and mental health support and training and personal training, all sorts of stuff, loads of educational workshops at gyms all over the country. It was amazing. I had a team of amazing volunteers. We hit some challenges towards the end because I just wasn't with it, and you let things get run away with you, etc. So it was the right thing to do, bring it back and kind of bring it to a close. But the legacy still very much lives on.
Yeah, for sure. I think stories are important, man. I don't think they will ever be saturated. Everyone can tell their story to one person and it can help them. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about that. Encourage as many people as possible to talk, for sure. Yeah, it's a powerful thing. You're 100% correct. Which is why I do this podcast. The more people that talk, the better. Aaron, as I've already said in our previous call and on this podcast, I could talk to you for hours. It's been truly a pleasure. You're very inspirational. You've worn many hats and you've done a lot in the space, which I'm extremely thankful for. And you are obviously where you are because of what you've done, which is amazing. Thanks once again, Aaron.